Here's a number I want you to sit with before we even start. In 2018, the Office of the Children's Commissioner for England published a report called Who Knows What About Me? It found that by the time the average child turns 13, their parents have posted around 1,300 photos and videos of them online. The same report found that once children start posting themselves aged 11 to 16, they add to that an average of 26 posts a day, which works out to close to 70,000 posts by the age of 18. Before that child has ever made a single choice about their own digital footprint, over 1,000 data points already exist about their face, their location, their milestones, and their body. Now, that's not a clinician doing that, that's not a marketing agency, that's parents. Ordinary, loving parents sharing because sharing feels like connection. So, today's episode isn't really about marketing and clinics, it's actually about the environment our clients and patients live in, the research behind what's actually happening when a child's image goes online, and then, because of course we're still going to be unpacking ethics and compliance, but what this actually means for allied health professionals who work with kids every single day. My name is Maddie, and this is Practice What You Post, and welcome to episode 4. Now, some quick housekeeping before we dive in. Episode 3 was a conversation with the team at Blackwell and West about investigations and misconduct in healthcare marketing. So, if you haven't listened to that yet, go back to it after this one. It pairs really well with today's topic because both episodes come down to the same question: who actually gets to consent and who's making that decision on someone else's behalf? Now, I'm going to go deep today on a term that you may not have heard yet, even though you may certainly have seen it in practice: sharenting. Now, it's the blend of share and parenting, and it describes the now normalized habit of parents posting details, images, and milestones of their children online, often starting before the child is even born. Now, I want to be really clear about the angle that I'm taking. I'm not here to shame parents about posting online, and I'm not interested in making anyone feel bad about photos they have posted in the past. What I'm actually interested in is the research, the actual public health and developmental data on what happens when a child grows up with a fully documented digital history that they never agreed to, and what this means for those who are running clinics, especially for those who are working with children and families. So, we're going to unpack 3 parts today. First is we're going to unpack the research on sharenting itself. Secondly, where this intersects directly with allied health. And third is a practical framework that you can implement this week. Okay, so to unpack parents' sharenting behaviors, there was a systematic review of motivations, attitudes, perceptions, and impression management perspectives, which, so if you don't know what sharenting is, it involves parents sharing photos, videos, and other information about their children on their social media profiles via online platforms. And essentially, the main objective of this article was to explore the role of motivations, perceptions, attitudes, and impression management on parents' sharenting behavior. And so, this systematic review, it basically looked into studies from 2019 to 2024. So, what I would like to do is I'd like to unpack the review. When it comes to the motivations, parents share for intrinsic reasons, so documenting memories, pride in milestones, emotional connection with family and friends, and then the extrinsic reasons, so social validation, conforming to parenting norms, and also in some cases financial incentives through influencer culture. In regards to the perception, so most parents are aware of privacy risks but tend to underestimate or downplay them, prioritizing the social and emotional benefits of sharing. The next one was also unpacking the attitudes. So both parents and children generally view sharenting or sharing images of themselves and the family online positively when it celebrates achievements and strengthens family bonds. However, children do frequently express discomfort or frustration when content is shared without their consent, especially when it comes to anything embarrassing or personal. And then when it comes to the impression management, parents often curate content strategically to present themselves as competent caregivers, and this also sometimes they will screen out anything that would reflect poorly on their parenting. So, I guess when we're thinking a little bit more about the discussions around this is that obviously this review does frame sharenting as sitting at the intersection of parents' expressive rights and children's rights to privacy and autonomy. And I think that obviously we're thinking about it from like a regulatory paradox where legal frameworks haven't really kept up with the pace. Obviously, when we're thinking about it from like a discussion and ethical tension perspective, the review does frame sharenting as sitting at the intersection of parents' expressive rights and children's rights to privacy and autonomy. But the thing that stood out to me the most was about the children's own preferences. So wanting to be consulted or like wanting their refusals to be respected. They are often overlooked, especially when they're very, very, very young. Now, obviously, the limitations of this study was that there was a reliance on self-reported data, and they only used one database, and there wasn't any formal, risk of bias tool applied. However, when we're thinking a little bit more about the ongoing recommendations are from the research, the authors of this call for a collaborative response, parents adopting more consent-based, privacy-conscious sharing habits, policymakers strengthening children's digital rights protections, professionals raising awareness, and also researchers investigating long-term effects and ways to balance parental and child interests. So let's actually talk a little bit about the scale. So look, there is a lot of different countries, different methodologies, there's different numbers about what is being shared and what's not. But something that is common across the globe is that there is a generation of children, and this generation of children, there is surveillance around them all the time. And this surveillance is actually coming from the people that love them the most. So, essentially, what happens because of that as a result? So, the first point that I wanted to highlight is around consent and autonomy. So, this is the foundational issue underneath everything else. A newborn can't consent to their birth story being shared. A toddler can't consent to the tantrum being filmed for content. A 7 year old can express a preference, sure, but when we're thinking a little bit more about the difference between permanent and public, if we think a little bit more around our digital identity and thinking about digital footprints, we have to remember that what this means is a child's online presence is often substantial and searchable well before that child actually understands the extent to where their images and content can end up. Now, the second one is obviously privacy and safety risks, and this is the part that does tend to get the most attention online. So, we're thinking a little bit more about the types of images that are being shared. If we look at the role of AI and how they can take that data, we need to also remember that there is a darker end to where these images and this information about a child can end up. And if you can't explicitly state and know confidently where that image is going to go up, if it is downloaded, it is screenshotted, or it's shared to someone that you don't know, then we really need to make sure that we are making informed decisions when children are actually being posted online. And there's another part as well, which comes down to geotagging. So, geotagging is when you actually link the location of where you are sharing it. A photo posted with that location data attached, taken outside a school, a swimming pool, a home, it builds a pattern of where a specific child can reliably be found at specific times. And again, you have no idea where that information is going. And now, the third one I want to talk about is actually the potential harm this could have on the child. And this is specifically from around parents uploading content that potentially the child might be actually embarrassed about a lot later, and looking a little bit more about teenagers that might have opinions about their own childhood being shared online. We've seen a lot of family influences that where you've got children that have had their whole lives be broadcasted online, and how that there's a lot of teens that feel this sense of loss of control about their own narrative, and more so much around they never got to be able to say, or they were never able to have their childhood just be private. And I think that's also something that I've seen with the rise of mum influencers. And I hold the belief that children are not a prop, and that they aren't just an accessory to be used for a specific type of content. I also wanted to talk a little bit about something specifically about health related sharenting. And now, this is about parents posting about a child's medical condition, diagnosis, or therapy journey. And now, this matters for a lot of people in allied health. And I think that this conversation can go in both directions. Now, on one hand, obviously, when we're talking a little bit about journeys, you've got parents navigating similar experiences and validation. And then on the other hand, you've got children later describing discomfort at discovering that their own medical history was searchable by future employers or romantic partners, their own social circle, without them ever actually having chosen to disclose it themselves. And so this is something to think about when we're even thinking about how health content is shared online and how this really merges with sharenting. And now I want to now talk a little bit about how we can bring this into the clinic and where this meets allied health. Now, if you run or work in a clinic that treats children, so maybe you're like a pediatric physiotherapy, OT, speech pathologist, maybe you work in dentistry or psychology, there is a very good chance that at some point you want to communicate with your target audience that you work with children, and potentially maybe you have seen content from other people that you follow that have actually shared maybe behind the scenes of their therapy day, or even just some videos as well. And I understand why this does happen, because a lot of social media advice will talk a little bit about showing the behind the scenes to develop that trust and to show what you do in a session. And often parents actually are in the moment are very thrilled, and they will maybe sign something as part of consent to upload it. However, parental consent is not the same as the child's consent, and the child at the end of the day is your patient. And if we want to talk a little bit about ARPRA guidelines and broader health record principles that they sit on, that patient is the person receiving the care. So even when that patient is 4 years old, a parent's signature on a consent form that says that you can share content about them and says, yes, you can, you got permission to post. However, it doesn't resolve the ethical dilemma that we just spoke about, because that child will grow up and that footage will still be there, and they never got to have a say in that. The second one is that this is health information, not lifestyle content. A video of a child's therapy session is documentation of a health condition or developmental need, and that's the same category of sensitivity as any other patient health data. The fact that it is warm and positive and oh wow, there's like behind the scenes, it doesn't change its classification. And we really have to think a lot more about how, without a very clear, specific, informed consent process, still applies to a minor who can't self advocate. So that's really something to think about as well. And the third one is permanence versus the therapeutic relationship. So families come to your clinic during a very vulnerable and sometimes difficult chapter. A diagnosis, a delay, whatever might be going on, the content that you post during that chapter becomes a permanent public artifact of that family's most vulnerable moment, searchable by the child's future classmates, future employers, future partners, and even glowing progress content freezes a child's medical narrative publicly for an audience that includes people who haven't even been born yet. And so it doesn't mean to say that children can't ever be seen in large aspects of media. However, what I am saying is that just because a parent has said yes, it's actually the floor baseline of the conversation. It's not where that conversation ends. And I believe that as an allied health professional, your job is to protect your patients and your clients and minors at the end of the day, and posting children online puts them at risk. So let's actually make this actionable. I want to talk a little bit about a framework that you can put in place this week. So I'm going to keep this to 5 checkpoints. So, checkpoint one is I want you to build a specific written child content. So, checkpoint one is I want you to build a specific social media policy that refers to no minors and no children being posted online. And I really believe that a may use photos for marketing purposes buried, on page 6 of an intake form. It doesn't meet the bar that we should actually be aiming for. And the way that I always work with clients is you're always better to be safe than sorry. And so really making sure that you can put in a child safety policy under social media and actually have that, and make sure that everyone, admin, social media, anyone that's working in practice management, any partners, everyone is across it, because that way you can actually have a child safe, ethical social media presence, which I think should be the bare minimum. The second checkpoint that I want to talk about is if you do ever want to create brand imagery, you can definitely create content without actually showing a recognizable named child. So if you were to do that, there would obviously be talent release forms that you need to think about, and actually structuring it with a photographer. But you'd be focusing on getting content of their hands, their feet, them doing activities, whatever that might be, and making sure there is no way that a member of the public could identify them as being associated with your clinic. And this one change alone resolves most of the risks that we've spoken about in the first segment, anyways. So, really thinking about actually investing in adequate and proper brand imagery, but doing it in a way that still communicates to your target audience that you do work with children, but doing it in a way that is very safe and doing it actually properly as well. Now, the third checkpoint that I want to talk about is being able to ensure that your team understands the difference between what content can go up online and that is compliant and ethical versus, oh, this is just cute, I just want to post it. This is genuinely the most common thing that I see on social media where clinics go wrong. So what happens is usually it could be like an admin worker, or there is a assistant worker that is working as part of the clinic, and they might take a photo or they might get something because they are a little bit more in touch with social media. It might be quite spontaneous, it might be joyful, and the parents are all excited about it because their child gets to be on social media. It goes through this content pipeline without actually going through any type of specific, like, I guess, like compliance process. And so, what I always recommend is having a very simple internal rule that nothing featuring an identifiable child goes into scheduling or posting, making sure that you're going through a checklist and being like, okay, is this ethical? Is this compliant? And that's why, again, having something like proper and adequate brand imagery is really important. And this is something that we talk about in, I think it's module 3 of our APRA advertising guidelines course, is really going into the depths of what type of content you can post and the things that you should avoid. So, regardless of how good the actual content is, you want to make sure that you are respecting that child's safety and their privacy at all times. The next one that I want to talk a little bit about is being able to build a bit of a review process. This is a little bit different to the last checkpoint, but making sure that when you are creating content and coming up with ideation and content ideas, making sure that there are no ideas that come up that would put a child's privacy or safety at risk. So if you're going to come up with content, being able to really unpack and identify, okay, this is the type of content, what type of lens are we going to be working with, and not just having like upload. So a lot of clinics will just post content on the week of, and very few actually have a process for thinking strategically about their social media. If you're going to be thinking about the next 12 months of your content, making sure that you can create a social media, not only like a brand and having a social media grid, but making sure that you actually leave a really good impression. Like, I know that if I had a child, I would be looking for a clinic that does not post any identifiable features of children online. This then goes into my next point, which goes into checkpoint 5, which really start extending some of this into if you do have children, and how you're actually showing up online. Because if you are a clinic owner posting your personal brand along your business, this is something to think about from a values perspective. So, a lot of allied health business owners will build an audience and they'll build their trust by showing a lot of their life. And for many people, it might include your own children. Again, I'm not telling you what to do here, but this is just to think about your personal brand and how you want to show up online when people are like, okay, do they align with my values? But what I would probably suggest instead is maybe applying the same lens that you would apply to a patient. Would my child at 16 be comfortable that this content exists online? Would they have wanted to say? And if the answer is like, I'm not sure, then it is really useful information and it's simply a prompt to make a more deliberate choice next time, and thinking a lot more about how you can create content that isn't revolving around a child. So, here's what I want to leave this episode with, because obviously, thousands of images of a child online before that child has ever got a say in any of that. Quite interesting. And I think that as allied health professionals, you sit at a particular intersection of this issue, because the content that I see going viral of that issue is because when it comes to health information about a person, especially children, when it comes to even like from a legal standpoint, from an ethical standpoint, they aren't capable of consenting to that content going online. And the fix to all of this is to thinking a lot more about how we can create content that communicates what you do and that you work with children and that you do amazing work, but not putting any child's privacy or safety at risk. And I think that that's something that when we're thinking about creating content that reflects your expertise and your values, this is something that is growing. And when the e-safety commissioner had mentioned like to schools like no longer safe to share these images and content of children online, it's really prompted a lot of organizations to really think about what their social media policies and how they're actually showing up online. So just something to think about specifically. So that is episode 4, and keep an eye out for episode 5 because I'm very excited to unpack that one too. So if this episode changed how you're thinking about your own content pipeline, send it to another clinic owner who might need to hear it, and I will catch you next time on Practice What You Post.